She marched down the slope in flip-flops and fury, shrieking about her lake and my attitude. But when the deputy arrived and saw my deed, my rifle, and her drunk guests on camera, the whole mountain turned quiet except for Karen. Before we dive in, make sure to like, subscribe, and tap the bell, because you won't believe how deep this entitlement runs and how fast it collapses. I bought the cabin to get away from people like her. Nestled on a ridge above the lake, it sat just far enough from town that cell service dropped out and the roads turned to gravel. The kind of place where the only sounds were wind through pine needles and the slap of water against the dock. For 3 summers, it had been my sanctuary. I came out every June, stocked up on canned food and firewood, and left the world behind. The lake was small but clear, a glacial-fed pocket of heaven that never quite warmed even in August. No motorboats, no crowds, no ski jets buzzing past at dawn. Just loons and the occasional deer crossing the shore in the morning mist. I had the only deeded access for a mile in either direction, and I kept it marked, not just with signs but with well-maintained fences, worn paths, and a steel gate with a weathered lock. My peace didn't come cheap. It came with boundaries. It was a Thursday afternoon when I first heard them. Not 1 truck, but 3, crunching down the gravel road like they owned it. Music thumping, doors slamming, laughter too loud for a place like this. I looked out from the porch and saw folding chairs, coolers, a portable speaker, and about a dozen people heading down toward the lakefront. Teenagers, maybe early 20s. A woman in the lead with platinum hair and oversized sunglasses. I didn't recognize any of them. They didn't wave. By the time I grabbed my keys and started walking down the trail, I already knew the kind of conversation I was about to have. Some folks don't read signs. Some read them and think they're for someone else. The air shifted as I stepped through the tree line and onto the slope leading down to the water. The group had made themselves comfortable, sprawling across the flat rocks like it was a public park. One of the young men had already kicked off his shoes and was waist-deep in the lake, splashing and shouting to someone holding a phone up for video. Beer cans clinked. A woman in a neon swimsuit balanced on the edge of my dock, wobbling like she might dive. The woman with the platinum hair was seated on a collapsible lawn chair, legs crossed, drink in hand, barking something at a man fiddling with the speaker. She didn't look up until I was close enough for them to hear the gravel crunching beneath my boots. I kept my voice level, calm, the way I've learned to do when I know I'm about to be ignored. I told them they were on private property and needed to pack up and leave. The man in the lake raised his eyebrows and shouted, "Since when?" Another guy laughed and added something crude I didn't bother to catch. The woman in the chair stood up slowly, brushing off invisible dust from her shorts, and looked me over like she was appraising a stray dog. "This is a lake," she said, with a tone that mixed disbelief and condescension. "You can't own a lake." I told her I didn't own the lake, just the land they crossed to get to it. She smirked and waved her hand at the trees. "Relax. It's just water. We're not hurting anything." I didn't argue. I simply said they had 10 minutes to leave before I called it in. She didn't laugh, but someone behind her did. That was her first mistake. I didn't move, just stood there long enough for the silence to get uncomfortable. One of the younger men, red-faced and already sweating through his tank top, stepped forward like he wanted to make something of it. He stopped when he saw the phone in my hand, recording. I turned it slightly so they could see the screen. Then I flipped through the saved images of my deed, the boundary lines, the digital maps from the county assessor's office, and the dated survey that showed exactly where they were standing. She squinted, lips tight, but said nothing. The man beside her leaned in, then waved dismissively. "Who brings legal papers to a lake?" he muttered, then turned back toward the dock. That was when the one in the water flicked a cigarette toward the shore. It arced lazily, landed near a dry pile of pine needles, and smoked there for a second before I stepped over and crushed it out with my boot. The sound of the ember hissing against leather made something shift in me. These weren't lost hikers or clueless campers. They knew what they were doing. They just didn't think it mattered. I told them again to leave. 10 minutes. That was generous, considering the trespass, the cigarette, and the way she was looking at me now like I was the one out of place. As I turned to go, someone behind me shouted, "Bet he's got cameras up here too. Freaking cabin cop." More laughter. I paused just long enough to say, without looking back, "There are cameras, and if that dock gets damaged, You'll see yourself in court before your hangover fades." That stopped the laughter, but not the woman. She was already reaching for her phone, muttering something about calling the board. I hadn't taken 5 steps up the trail before I heard the crunch of hurried footsteps behind me. She caught up fast, phone raised, camera already rolling. Her voice came sharp and high, the tone of someone who thought volume could replace authority. "I'm recording this for the HOA," she said, breath short. "You can't threaten people with lawsuits for sitting by the lake." I kept walking. The camera followed. She tried to step in front of me, heels skidding slightly on the gravel. I stopped just long enough to make sure she didn't fall. Not for her sake, but because I didn't need her scraping a knee and turning that into another accusation. "I don't belong to your HOA," I said, clear and even. "Never have." That only made her double down. She started rattling off neighborhood rules, citations, something about a shared lake agreement from 15 years ago. I told her my property wasn't part of that arrangement. My deed was older, stand-alone. She called it outdated, said the rules had changed. Then she pulled out the phrase that made everything crystal. "My husband's on the board, and I'm tired of squatters like you thinking they can gate off public spaces." There it was, squatter. That word always says more about the person using it than the one it's thrown at. I looked at her then. Really looked. She didn't live out here. Not with that manicure or that attitude. She was visiting someone, playing queen for the weekend. But the power in her voice came from somewhere else. Not the land, not the law, just assumption. I told her she could call whoever she wanted. Sheriff, HOA, her husband, just not from my land. Then I turned, opened my gate, and locked it behind me. The gate creaked as I swung it shut and clicked the latch into place. Then I slipped the padlock through and gave it a tug to be sure. That sound, the click of the lock sliding home, always settled something in me. Not out of fear, just finality. There's comfort in knowing the line is drawn and held. Back on the porch, I sat for a while, just listening. The music down by the water had dropped a little, but I could still hear it drifting up through the trees. I opened my phone and pulled up the cabin's security app. 2 cameras, one on the trail, the other facing the dock. The screen flickered for a moment before the feed came clear. The woman Karen, though I didn't know her name, yet was standing with her hands on her hips, talking to someone behind her. She looked smaller on the screen. Her voice, so sharp up close, was just silent motion now. One of the men stumbled near the dock, unzipped his fly, and relieved himself in the brush. Another tossed an empty bottle into the water. I tapped the screen and hit record, saving the footage to the cloud. Then I called my lawyer, not because I expected a court case, but because it was always better to have things documented. She picked up on the second ring, listened without interruption, and said she'd make a note of it. Said I did the right thing. Said if they came back after warning, it wouldn't just be trespassing, it'd be willful. I thanked her, then hung up and watched the sun dip toward the trees. The laughter below had faded to low murmurs, but I knew the quiet wouldn't last. Folks like that never leave on the first ask. The next morning started with birdsong and a chill mist rolling off the lake. I made coffee and sat on the porch wrapped in my old flannel, watching the sun burn through the fog. For a while, it felt like things were back to normal. Then I heard the crunch of tires on gravel and the low rumble of a truck engine climbing the trail. I stood before the gate opened. A white sheriff's vehicle pulled into view, dust curling behind it. The door opened, and a middle-aged deputy stepped out. Broad shoulders, worn boots, sunglasses tucked into the front of his shirt. He gave a quick nod. "Morning," he said. "Morning," I replied. He asked if I was the owner of the property. I said I was and offered him a seat on the porch. He declined, glanced around, and pulled out a notepad. "We got a call yesterday," he said. "Complaint about threats and firearms near the lake. A woman said she and her family were harassed." I let that settle in the space between us. Then I unlocked the gate, invited him in, and asked if he wanted to see the footage. He didn't hesitate. Inside, I showed him everything. The group coming down the trail, the cigarette tossed, the bottle thrown, the urinating guest. The woman following me, phone raised, shouting about rules that didn't apply. When it was done, he leaned back and sighed. "That her?" he asked, pointing at the woman on the screen. I nodded. He scratched the back of his neck. then looked out toward the lake. "You're not the first," he said, "but you're the first with receipts." He didn't smile when he said it, just made another note and asked for a copy of the footage. I gave it to him without a word. He tucked the flash drive into his shirt pocket, then flipped to a new page in his notebook. Said he needed to log both sides of the story, even if the footage already spoke volumes. I understood. I asked what exactly she had claimed, more curious than concerned. He read from his notes. Said you confronted them with a weapon, that you waved it around and made threats, that you claimed the entire lake belonged to you and told them to get off your land or else. I raised my eyebrows but kept quiet. He glanced at me, then back to the page. She also said you used racial slurs, that you were drunk, that you blocked them in with your truck so they couldn't leave. I leaned against the porch rail and let out a slow breath. It wasn't anger that stirred in me. It was something colder, familiar. The kind of accusation designed not to seek justice, but to twist perception just enough to cause doubt. "Do I seem drunk to you?" I asked. He shook his head. "Not even close." "Did I block anyone in?" He didn't answer that directly, just looked down at his notes and flipped them shut. "Between you and me," he said, voice lower, "this isn't the first time she's spun a story to fit her mood, but we have to respond when someone calls in something like that, especially when they mention a weapon." I nodded, told him I understood. He looked back out toward the lake. "You armed now?" I said no. The rifle stayed in the cabin. Hadn't touched it. He looked satisfied with that, jotted one last note and said he'd go speak with her directly. As he walked down the trail, I watched the wind ripple the water, calm as ever. I followed him down the trail at a distance, just enough to stay within earshot without crowding his space. Karen and her group were gathered near the dock, some sitting on coolers, others standing like they expected an apology. She straightened when she saw the sheriff, folding her arms like someone preparing a speech. He walked up slow, nodded once, and started asking her questions. Calm, polite, but direct. She launched into her version again, adding new details show I'd supposedly screamed at her. How I blocked the road. How her guests felt unsafe. The deputy listened without interrupting. He didn't take notes this time, just stood there, hands on his belt, waiting. Then he asked where she thought the public access point was. She hesitated, said it was common knowledge the lake was public. He nodded, pulled out his phone and brought up the GIS map. Said he wanted to make sure everyone was clear. He pointed at the satellite image, then zoomed in. "This parcel right here," he said, "from the tree line down to the dock, belongs to the man up the hill. Not part of the HOA, not under shared access, deeded private since 1964. County records back it up." Karen blinked, still holding her phone like she hadn't heard him. "There's no easement?" she asked. "Nope, and no right-of-way through his trail either." She glanced at one of the younger men behind her, who looked away. The deputy kept going. "If you walked past the sign, past the gate, and onto his dock, you're trespassing. Doesn't matter how long you've been coming to the lake." There wasn't much left to say after that. Karen's jaw moved like she wanted to argue, but the words never came. The breeze picked up, and for the first time since morning, the lake felt quiet again. The deputy didn't raise his voice, didn't scold them, just laid out the facts like setting tools on a workbench. Simple and solid. Karen crossed her arms tighter, but her guests were already shifting. A few picked up their things. One of the younger women rolled up a beach towel and shoved it into a tote. It was clear the mood had changed. He gave them one last chance to leave without citations. Told them it was best to pack up, respect the line, and move on. That would have been the end of it. Then one of the men, the same one who had tossed the bottle, leaned against a rock and said, "This lake's better than the one at the golf course HOA anyway. No cameras there." The deputy turned toward him slowly. That one sentence had more weight than the man knew. Karen's claim that this was just a public spot they stumbled into started to crack right there. If they had another HOA's lake to compare this one to, it meant they knew exactly where they were, and that they had chosen to come here for a reason. "You're with the Ridgeview group?" the deputy asked. The man shrugged. "My brother has a place up there." "Why?" "Then you definitely know this isn't public land," he said. Karen muttered something under her breath, but it didn't matter anymore. The deputy stepped away and started jotting names, asked for IDs. 2 of the guests didn't have them. That didn't go over well. I stood back, watching from the edge of the trail, arms crossed. I had offered grace once. This part wasn't mine to control. The law had taken over, and they were learning that paper, cameras, and patience held more power than they expected. When the deputy came back up the trail, his pace was slower, his notebook full. He didn't say much at first, just handed me back the flash drive and asked if I had a minute to show him the live feeds again. I nodded and opened the cabin door. Inside, I pulled up the camera footage and cued the clips. We watched together, the screen glowing in the dim room. The first clip showed the group walking in, passing the private property signs without pause. The second showed the man in the tank top stumbling through the brush. Then came Karen, phone in hand, shouting at my back as I walked up the trail. Her voice was shrill even through the small speakers. You could hear her accuse me of threatening her. You could also hear me say nothing at all. He leaned in closer when the last clip rolled. It showed one of the guests, the same one who bragged about the other HOA, grabbing a bottle and hurling it toward the lake. It smashed just off camera with a sound sharp enough to quiet the room. The deputy sat back, arms folded, quiet for a long time. Not much grey area in that, he said. I didn't answer. He stood, gave a nod toward the monitor, and said, I wish more folks had this kind of record. Makes the job cleaner. Outside, the wind picked up again, rustling the pines. He walked to the porch, took a breath, then said, I'll be issuing citations, trespassing, open containers, and 1 for littering. Karen's voice carried faintly from down the trail, still going, still trying. He shook his head. I don't think she realizes the camera caught all of it. I said nothing. Some lessons only stick when silence follows. By the time we reached the trailhead, the group had begun to shrink. A few guests had slipped away early, sensing which way the wind was blowing. The ones who stayed were quieter now. Karen stood with her hands on her hips, facing the lake like it might offer her some kind of support. The deputy stepped in front of her and spoke low, his voice flat and measured. He explained the citations, what they meant, and what the fine amounts would be. Trespassing for all of them. Open container violations for the ones holding beers in the footage. Littering for the man who threw the bottle. She opened her mouth to argue, but he raised a hand. Don't, he said. I've seen enough. Her jaw clenched. She looked at me, then back at him. This is ridiculous, she said. You're taking his side. He didn't flinch. I'm taking the side of the law. You crossed the line. You stayed after being told to leave. And you made false claims to dispatch. That's not just rude. That's criminal. The man beside her shifted, muttering something too soft to hear. The deputy took their IDs again, copied what he needed, and handed back the slips. Karen took hers like it was covered in dirt. Her pride had taken more damage than anything else. As the group packed up, slower now, quieter now, I stayed near the gate. I didn't need to say anything. My presence was enough. The deputy turned as he walked back to his truck. Ma'am, he said to her, you're lucky this man's more patient than most. I suggest you remember that. She didn't reply, just climbed into her car, slammed the door, and stared out at the lake like it had betrayed her. The peace had returned, but not for her. The next morning was quiet again. No engines, no music, just the soft rhythm of the lake brushing the shore. I sat on the porch with coffee in hand, watching the sunlight ripple across the water, when I heard the slow roll of tires coming up the trail. This time, just one vehicle. A silver SUV, cleaner than the ones from before, pulled to a stop by the gate. A man stepped out first. Grey hair, collared shirt, expensive watch. He moved like someone used to being listened to. Karen followed behind him, sunglasses on, arms folded tight against her chest. She didn't look at me. He raised a hand in greeting, polite, but practiced. Morning, he said. I'm Greg, Karen's husband. I nodded, waited. I wanted to stop by, he continued, because I heard there was a misunderstanding. Karen mentioned there was a property dispute. I looked into it. Looks like she was mistaken. He gave a short, awkward laugh, then glanced back at her. She didn't speak. I just wanted to say we're sorry for any trouble. Things got out of hand and, well, tempers flared. I studied his face. The words were there, shaped just right, but they felt hollow. There was no real weight behind them, no real remorse. It was cleanup, reputation work. "I appreciate you coming," I said, but there wasn't a misunderstanding. There was a line, and it was crossed. He gave a slow nod, unsure how to respond. I stepped off the porch, walked to the gate, and gently set my hand on it. "I think we're done here." He didn't argue, just turned, touched Karen's arm, and led her back to the car. She didn't glance back. The engine started, and they eased down the trail, leaving the quiet behind. A few days passed without incident. The trees held their silence, and the lake returned to its natural rhythm. I fixed the edge of the dock where one of the guests had cracked a board, restained the porch rail, and let the dust settle. I figured that was the end of it. But small towns have their own way of keeping score, and stories move faster than trucks on gravel roads. It started with a nod from the grocery clerk in town. Then a longer handshake from the man at the hardware store, who leaned in and said, "Heard you stood your ground up there. Good." I didn't ask how he knew. I didn't have to. Word gets around. The sheriff's office must have made some quiet calls. Or maybe it was one of Karen's guests who didn't like being caught on camera. Either way, the story filtered through the town in Peaceshire, trespassing, her attitude, the citations, the footage. I heard a version of it from the woman who runs the diner. Another version from the mail carrier, who smiled as she handed over a package. Most folks didn't ask for details. They already had what they needed. The image of a man who owned his land, kept his calm, and didn't back down when pushed. Not with threats, not with noise, not even with lies. One evening I got a call from a councilman I barely knew. He said he appreciated how I handled it. Said Karen's name had come up before, usually behind closed doors, always with a groan. "She's not used to people saying no," he told me, "but she'll think twice next time." I hung up the phone and walked back to the porch, the sun slipping low behind the trees. Some people talk, others remember. The lake didn't hold a grudge. It stayed the same as it always had, quiet and wide, silver in the morning and deep blue by late afternoon. I spent more time by the water after things settled. Cleaned the dock again, repainted the faded numbers on the back gate, put out a new sign, simple lettering carved into cedar, "Private property, no access without permission." I didn't put it there out of fear. I put it there as a reminder. Some folks don't need signs. Others won't hear anything without one. Most days passed without visitors. I'd sit on the porch in the evening, polishing the rifle I never needed to carry, sipping coffee or bourbon depending on the weather. I listened to the wind, the birds, the creak of the trees in the breeze, the kind of sounds that let you breathe all the way in. The cameras still ran, but I stopped checking them as often. Not because I expected trouble to stay gone, but because I trusted myself to handle it if it came again. I had the tools, the record, the patience. Most of all, I had the boundary, and now it meant something. No trucks came down the trail. No loud music. Even the town felt different. People nodded more. Strangers gave space. That story, whatever version of it they'd heard, did its work. It didn't make me a hero. It just made me someone people understood not to push. One evening, I stood at the water's edge and watched the sun burn gold across the surface. Not a ripple, not a voice, just peace, thick and steady. Not because the world changed, but because I hadn't let it take something from me. Not this time. Not here. The package came on a Tuesday, tucked into the mailbox where only the most determined drivers bothered to stop. No return address. Just my name, written in neat, careful handwriting on the top. I carried it up to the porch and opened it slow, blade drawn steady down the seam. Inside was a bottle of whiskey, aged and expensive, the kind you only open on rare nights. Beneath it, folded once and slipped into the corner, was a note. It read, "Some folks learn late, others never do. Thanks for holding the line. From someone who wishes they had. Once." No name. No clue. I stared at the paper for a long time. It could have been anyone. Someone from the group, someone from town, maybe someone who'd heard the story secondhand and saw their own silence reflected in it. Regret doesn't always arrive in apology. Sometimes it comes bottled, signed by absence, and left with a lesson. I poured a glass that night and sat out by the dock, the sky gone purple with the last light. The lake didn't care what had happened. It had outlived louder stories, but it held my reflection steady. The gate stayed locked. The signs stayed firm. But I didn't feel closed off. I felt sure. There's a kind of freedom in claiming your ground without raising your voice, in answering entitlement with stillness. That's what stayed with me. Not the trespass, not even the sheriff's visit. Just the quiet after, the respect earned without asking. I watched the stars rise and tipped my glass toward the trees. Some folks listen to the law, some only listen to fences, but the ones who stay, they're the ones who understand why we build them in the first place.